Hello, I'm Mary Nightingale. I'd like to congratulate London's longest-running hospital radio station, Radio Brockley, on 50 years of broadcasting to the Royal National Orthopaedic Hospital in Stanmore.
Radio Brockley, 50 years, 50 voices.
Hello and welcome to The Remedy, the show that explores different religious and cultural approaches to healing with me, Naomi Richman. In this show, I will be discovering which ancient truths we can draw on to better understand the nature of health and promote healing. I'll be speaking to key representatives from different faith communities to find out what insights their religions can offer to those looking for healing in today's modern world. And I'd just like to say as well that this show has been especially produced in celebration of Radio Brockley's 50th anniversary. So before we begin, we must ask, what is the connection between religion and medicine? What has God, heaven and hell got to do with diseases, doctors and hospitals? In today's world, every minute detail of our lives appears to be informed by scientific advancement, not religion. From the moment we wake up in the morning, we use toothpaste that vows to make our teeth whiter, even though we don't really know how it works or what we are even putting into our mouths. We go to the gym and follow clean eating trends, promising weight loss, better skin, and a general sense of well-being. We sit at ergonomic chairs promoting good posture and use computer keyboards that prevent carpal tunnel. Science seems to have all the answers. So, in this day and age, what can religion offer us? Let's start by considering how we arrived at the present day. If we look to the past, we discover that the connection between religion and medicine is pretty ancient and pretty universal. Every culture has had a place for the local doctor or healer, who was traditionally also the local priest. The mysteriousness of healing has meant that it has always been associated with spirituality and even magic. Shamans of the Native American religions are the oldest known type of healers and take potent hallucinogens to communicate with the spirits in order to ask them which medicines their patients need. In the ancient Greek period, many healers would only prescribe medicine after invoking Asclepios, the Greek god of healing. In medieval Christianity, sickness was explained as a punishment for our sins, and in Islam, illness might be understood as a jinn, a kind of demon. So in the year 2016, is it safe to say we have left these superstitions behind? Well, in fact, we are more reluctant to let them go than we may wish to admit. Since the 1970s, alternative medicines have exploded onto the scene, promising to harness the wisdom of ancient traditions to effect cures. For instance, the fashionable system of Ayurveda has a strong spiritual component centering on worship of the Indian medicine god, Dhanvantari. Looking to the past for answers is just one way people are searching for more meaning in their lives, beyond what modern life is currently able to offer them. This can sometimes even involve rejecting widely accepted scientific theories in favour of a kind of anti-intellectualism. Key examples could include the anti-vaccination movement, which has been gaining ground in America, and the recent explosion in restrictive clean eating trends such as dairy-free, gluten-free, vegan, alkaline, raw paleo diets. All of these trends reveal something much deeper in our psyche that is not going away. A craving for something that is beyond science and offers our lives more meaning, more magic, and more spirituality. After all, what exactly is the sense of peace and well-being promised by these health movements, if not something that is more than physical, something spiritual?
This is Radio Brockley.
Christian approaches to healing have, naturally, been immensely influential over the course of our history and up to the present day. If we turn back the clock right to the beginning of Christianity, we see that Jesus himself sets a precedent by placing immense value in the power of healing. For him, healing functions as a way to demonstrate the significance of faith. In the Gospels, Jesus performs over 30 healing miracles. He heals lepers, the epileptic, those possessed by demons, and the blind over the course of his ministry. In all of these occasions, Jesus makes it very clear that you must believe in his power and have true faith in God if you are to be healed. If you are doubting or sceptical, on the other hand, you will be met with scepticism in return. the message presented by Jesus is unmistakable. Faith is a necessary condition for successful and complete healing. As Jesus says, "He who believes in me shall never die." Whilst the majority of Christian believers seek to combine the insights of medical scientists with a spiritual approach to well-being, others have chosen to reject medicine and may view it as an obstacle to their recovery. Jehovah's Witnesses famously reject blood transfusions on the grounds that God is responsible for giving and taking blood and therefore life, and so it is not our place to interfere with the plan he has for us. Faith healers, prevalent in the born-again church, believe that the Holy Spirit has the power to physically heal ailments. In church services, faith healers will call upon the Spirit to miraculously give the blind their sight back, make the infirm walk again, and even cure cancer. The faith healer will use prayer, lay his hands on the sick, or even perform a kind of exorcism called deliverance to heal. From the faith healing perspective, if the underlying root cause of the sickness is actually spiritual, then the cure needs to be spiritual too, for instance, repentance or trying to build your faith. There is therefore simply no use trying to treat a spiritual problem with a physical cure. This misses the point entirely. And if we push this argument even further, faith healers may say that using physical medicine shows a lack of trust in spiritual cures, which is probably the reason the patient is sick in the first place. They don't have enough faith. The only sensible solution for faith healers is therefore to rely on and strengthen their faith in Jesus' healing powers without the use of medicine until they are healed. Unsurprisingly, both Jehovah's Witnesses and faith healers have come under attack by secular groups and mainstream Christians alike on the grounds that rejecting access to medicines, which we are incredibly fortunate to have, is both frivolous and dangerous. What's more, some faith healers, such as Peter Popoff, have been exposed of profiteering from their ability to heal by taking large amounts of money from their congregation in return for healing them, whether or not they are really healed. Today, I'm joined by Reverend Jody Stowell from St Michael and All Angels Church in Harrow. Reverend Jody is a vicar passionate about her community and seeking gender equality in the church. Jody, thank you for joining me today.
My pleasure. Great to be here.
Can I ask you, what is faith healing as you understand it?
Well, it's interesting, isn't it? Because the term faith healing sort of conjures up these images in our head, perhaps of the sort of, white-suited American televangelist sort of idea. So I think, from where I'm coming from, I do believe that healing is a part of what the Christian faith has to offer. It would look quite different in my context. And what I would always want to do is go back and look at what Jesus was doing in terms of the healing, the stories, as you've said, and have a look at the holistic way in which Jesus was actually dealing with healing. So it's much broader than a cure.
So you could say that you see the faith healing exhibited by Jesus and described in the Gospels as quite a different type of healing to what we're calling faith healing.
Yes, certainly. I've certainly seen and be part of situations where I have seen Christians heal physically. So it's not that I would say that doesn't happen anymore. But actually, Jesus himself sometimes didn't and sometimes did. And it was always in the context of a sort of community event or a community experience. So there was a sense that it's more about a sort of well-being than a physical cure. So healing is much, much more holistic. It's about the whole person and understanding what the whole person needs in order to be well, rather than seeing a physical ailment and treating that particular thing. But I think what often Jesus is doing is bringing justice into that social situation. So there's often kind of an aspect of restoring a just social order into a community. So, for example, the story with the lepers, you would be put, literally on the outside of the community because, they didn't want the infection to spread. To heal from leprosy in that situation was to restore a person to within their community.
So you would say perhaps that healing in Christianity is about not simply just physical or even spiritual healing, but almost sort of social healing, social spiritual health or something like that.
Yeah, so it's about things being made right and recognising that we don't just exist as individuals, but actually the people that we are and our well-being rests not just on how we are in our own individual self, but actually on how we exist together in a community. You know, there's that phrase, isn't there, Ubuntu, I am because we are. So actually, if you are suffering, then we are suffering. And so there's a sense that well people, whoever they are, can't just sort of sit over here and put the unwell people over there and expect that their lives are just going to carry on wonderfully, because actually human beings are much more connected than that would imply.
So what is your view on faith healing, kind of as I described it, as is sometimes present in the born-again church? Is it something that the mainstream church should recognise and give more credence to?
I think most mainstream churches have an aspect of healing, you know, in their particular practices. So certainly within the Church of England, we have particular liturgies which are for healing. You know, you'll have healing services that you'll go to. You might use things like oil where people might come, you might anoint them, you know, and it might be that you're praying for a physical healing, but it might be that you're praying for a broader sort of understanding of what healing is for that person. You know, I think it is good, for sure, that we've moved from the, you know, you're ill because you've sinned and God's displeased with you in that way, to understanding, you know, the causes of sickness. But I also think it's really, really important that we don't, you know, swing too far in the other direction, that we remember that people actually exist as mind, body, spirit together, and actually those things interact. So although very often you can find a specific physical, bacterial or pathological cause for someone's illness, that actually it's not totally beyond the realms of possibility that there's emotional, spiritual things going on which interact with those things.
I mean, I just wonder, from my kind of experiences of witnessing faith healing, I wouldn't say it was necessarily all purely a assessment of their physical condition. Of course, sometimes the faith healer will announce that he wants to heal people who have bad legs or something, and then those people with bad legs will come up, and he might not know the individual situation of every person if it's particularly a large congregation. But generally speaking, it is a kind of his congregation of people he sees every week. He knows well it is part of his community. And so I'm sure he does kind of see it as a more broad healing than purely physical, especially because his sort of process of actually healing is a spiritual process, particularly the laying on of hands.
Yes, it's quite intimate as well sometimes.
So I'm not sure whether faith healing is necessarily physical, I'm saying, in that kind of born-again context. Is it possible that it could be physical, spiritual, social, all those things? Yeah,
I mean, I wouldn't want to lump everything together. Within the Christian tradition as a whole, and within each individual Christian tradition that we have, there's going to be a breadth of practice. There's going to be good practice and bad practice, for sure. What I'm interested in with that is that often the way we see it is it happens kind of very much in public. There's sort of a razzmatazz about it. And I guess my personality is more drawn towards that slightly quieter expression of faith healing, but I wouldn't ever want to say that means the rest is, totally to be dismissed at all.
Is there some risk in people putting faith in healing?
I mean, certainly there is a risk if it's taken to that extreme. There are sectors or organisations that decide they're not going to take any medication or have blood transfusions, and actually that is their choice, and people make those choices outside the religious context as well for varying reasons. I guess the difficulty is when people might go, they might feel they've been healed, they might choose to come off medication which they're on, and it's not that they're against medication, but they want to kind of show that they have faith that they've been healed. And I think, most people who are involved with praying for healing for people would say, don't do that. I've definitely been in churches where I've heard them say, if you feel you've been healed, that's absolutely wonderful, and praise God for that, but don't come off any medication. So I'm always heartened when I hear that. I don't think that Jesus ever said it's this or this. And although they didn't have medicine in the same way that we do today and understood things slightly differently, I think it's very much within the Christian faith to thank God for the skills and the doctors and the medicines that we've got, and to pray for the ultimate healing.
Well, that actually leads me quite nicely onto my next question, which is, of course, we mentioned how in Jesus' time people didn't have access to antibiotics and all the kind of knowledge and understanding which we have today. But in fact, we have to also appreciate that there are so many people in the world today who don't have access to medical treatments, particularly in kind of majority world countries where faith healing is very popular. There isn't often really an alternative. So could putting faith in faith healing be a good thing?
I guess I just, even in that context, I wouldn't want to pit those things against each other. I wouldn't want to say, well, just because we don't have that, therefore, we're going to use this. I think those things should come together. And certainly in those, in the majority world, it's a matter of justice that they don't have access to the things that they should have access to. So I wouldn't want it to be a case of, therefore we say, well, we'll go with faith healing, and we'll just forget about the fact that all these people are left to languish in a situation which is actually unjust. And those of us in this part of the world should actually be seeking justice, and that includes access to things like healthcare, education, all those things that give people the opportunities to flourish and be well.
So how would you then overall describe the Christian view of health and sickness?
I think there is a sort of sense within the Christian tradition about how we view the issue of suffering. So that actually suffering, although I wouldn't believe that God inflicts suffering, but that actually it's part of the human experience. And so God is with us in that suffering. And that actually there can be something that comes out of our suffering, which is good, if you see what I mean. It seems counterintuitive, but that actually there are some things which we experience when we're in pain, when we're suffering, when we're sick or whatever, that actually teaches us things. And so it's not entirely a negative experience in that sense. We shouldn't necessarily want to sanitize suffering. And that's, in times gone past, when they did used to take the people who were unwell and literally put them outside. We don't want to do that, because actually we recognise, as Jesus did, that the health and well-being of the community is based on the entire community being present. And understanding that sometimes in suffering, that actually some of our layers are gone and our experience of God can actually be intensified.
My last question really was going to ask you what Christianity can offer to people in today's world who are sick and looking for healing.
I think ultimately the Christian faith offers people hope, and it offers them an affirmation that actually God is interested in human beings, ultimately to the point of coming as a human being in Jesus Christ, so that Jesus knows what it is to suffer. Jesus knows what it is to experience loss through sickness. Jesus knows what it is ultimately to die. And so, the Christian faith has hope in a God who is like that, who understands all of those things. From the perspective of the Christian faith, death is the enemy. However, what Jesus did was to turn it on its head, so that the ultimate healing in the Christian faith is resurrection. And that can only happen actually through the doorway of death, So for the Christian faith, there is hope. There's hope for this life. There's hope for the life after.
Thank you so much for joining us today, Reverend Jody, and for helping us to deepen our understanding of different attitudes to healing here on The Remedy. Before I let you go, I just do have one final question. Music has a therapeutic quality to it, and I know from personal experience can really help make me feel better when I'm feeling down. All religions draw on the power of music and worship, and to heal their followers. What piece of Christian music have you found therapeutic in the past that you would be interested to share with our listeners?
In terms of a big hymn, I love There Is a Redeemer, which right at the end talks about, when we will see Jesus face to face. And I think, ultimately that's our healing.
Thank you very much.
There is your spirit to the work on earth is done.
This is Radio Brockley.
For the next segment of The Remedy, I'm going to explore the humanist worldview in order to find out what humanists think about healing. Now, for those of you wondering what exactly humanism is, well, let me say this. If you're atheist, agnostic, or just broadly secular, you are most likely humanist even if you don't realise it. In its most simple form, humanism is a system of belief that puts humans, rather than God, at the centre. This means that humanists believe we should all aim to be good people and contribute to society in our lifetimes, not because it will please God or might secure our spot in heaven, but because it will benefit other humans. According to humanism, life has its own intrinsic value, and that value does not come from God having given it meaning. Whether or not God exists, we cannot deny the significance and meaning of the lives of humanity's greats, like Shakespeare or Marie Curie. As a result of this human focus, humanists are generally atheists, not least because they advocate a critical and scientific approach, which means they are sceptical of the idea that supernatural beings, such as gods, angels, or demons, exist. Nonetheless, there is no centralised humanist manifesto which humanists must support in order to be humanist. In fact, humanists vary in their beliefs and on the whole may be wary of conformity. Naturally then, there is also no centralised single humanist organisation, and humanists are generally critical of vast institutions like the Church. Humanists believe that no institution should try to tell us what to think, believe and do. Instead, we should try to discover who we are and how best to fulfil our potential. We are all unique and should celebrate our individuality and autonomy by making our own decisions for our own sake, rather than for God. With their emphasis on the power of reason, humanists look towards science to answer life's big questions. Their attitude to health, healing and medicine follows this pattern. Sickness is a physical condition with a physical cause, and therefore needs a physical cure, humanists believe. Humanists place great faith and respect in humanity's scientific advancements, which are an example of human achievement and our flourishing as a species. We should therefore make the most of what science has to offer and trust our doctors when we are sick. In response to faith healing, then, a humanist would say that the reasonable likelihood of a healing miracle occurring is very slim, as it would go against what our experience shows us is possible. Therefore, it is far more likely that there is a rational explanation for the event. For instance, that people just sometimes get better through the body's natural processes of recovery. Another explanation might be the placebo effect, that the patient's belief in the power of the miracle is so strong that the mind is able to convince the body it is healed. Many healing miracles have been proven to be fake or explained scientifically. Darren Brown has a series of videos on YouTube where he exposes different faith healing miracles as magic tricks by explaining exactly how they are performed. Fraudulent healing miracles are nothing new. Peter Popoff was found to be wearing an earpiece through which he was being fed personal information about his congregants, which he pretended had been revealed to him by the Holy Spirit, in order to win their trust and take their money. Where there is no deception involved, claims of miraculous healing may be colourful interpretations of unusual natural events, as the British Humanist Association puts it. Therefore, we should always examine the evidence and weigh up the probabilities based on our previous experiences. In practice, this means turning to science, a human enterprise, rather than God for healing. Finally, without God, it makes no sense for humanists to believe in reincarnation or life after death. It means understanding that this life is the only life we have and we should embrace it. We should focus on the present, the now, rather than our past mistakes or what may happen after we die. Humanists believe we only have one life, so we should try and make the most of it. I'm joined by David Flint, the Vice Chair of the North London Humanists. Thank you very much for coming, David. Let me start by asking, what does humanism mean to you?
Well, I think you've already said a good deal of what I might say, and actually in rather more eloquent words. Let me sum it up with a quote from Bertrand Russell. He says, "The good life is one inspired by love and guided by science." I think that's a reasonable potted summary. I'm not sure I can live up to that, but that's what I'd like to do. That's what I see as humanism as requiring of us.
And can you tell our listeners the story of how you came to be a humanist?
Well, I suppose I can. It all gets a bit complicated, but for essentially social reasons, in my teens, I attended a Christian church. I was always doubtful about the doctrine. I didn't become confirmed. I was very uncertain about the doctrine. And this continued. But actually, there were two ministers of religion who were responsible for my departure from such faith as I had. One was a Methodist minister who was my RE teacher at school. He liked to run the RE classes as an argument about ideas. And so the RE class tended to turn into a sort of intellectual tennis match between me and him, since he would generally take an orthodox view and I would always take an unorthodox view. And this taught me skills of analysis and debating, which I'm sure have served me well. I got on personally very well with him, and he regarded me as a useful foil for the points he wanted to make, and I thought the same about him. So that worked very well. Going into the sixth form, he gave us all to read a book called Honest to God by John Robinson, who was then the Bishop of Liverpool. This was a work of theology. I won't attempt to summarise it because it's wholly beyond my ability, but at the time it persuaded me completely that if this was what Christianity was, then I wanted no part of it. It simply had no intelligible content, and I therefore stopped going to church. And you must understand that when I say that, I mean that I had been going every week, and I stopped and never went again, because that was what the logic seemed to require. I then went to a talk by a local minister at a youth fellowship, and he talked about humanism. And I thought, that's really interesting, this sounds like me. And when a few months later I went to college, I joined the Humanist Society and found indeed it was me. So then I became a humanist in both name as well as in substance. Most humanists, I find, have come to a good part of their ideas independently and only subsequently realise that there is a label for those ideas and a coherent doctrine. Humanism, as you said, does not have a creed. It does not have a holy text. It has rather a commitment to the power of reason, a commitment to respect evidence, and a commitment to caring for other people. That, I think, is what is central to humanism, not any particular beliefs beyond that.
I'd absolutely agree with that. I quite like to think of humanism as almost a method of approaching life, of being quite critical, asking questions and challenging things, rather than a set of beliefs that you must follow in order to call yourself a humanist.
Yes, I agree with that. It doesn't always make you popular. It doesn't always make you popular, even with people who are basically of the same mind. When you say, well, actually, I disagree with this particular sacred cow, and that can be a bit tricky, but I think it is what is required.
So one of the questions I wanted to ask you was, what differentiates humanism from other religious systems is that really there's no belief in God, and particularly the afterlife. How would you therefore respond to the claim that in promising no afterlife, humanism offers no hope for those sick and suffering?
I think for many people, the idea that as they approach death, they face a judgment by God, for those who believe in it, is really extremely worrying. And well, it may be, because while you may think you know the mind of God, you may have read the holy texts, you also know that for any given holy text, there are multiple interpretations. You may have diligently followed one view, But it may be that God has a different view about what the Holy Text said. So nobody, it seems to me, can go into that situation with confidence that they have done the right things and that God will smile on them. What humanism brings is the sense that all that can be put aside, that we do not face a judgment after death, because death is the end of our life. It is the end of our experience. We may face our own judgment. We may look back on our lives and say, I said that I would do this, I didn't do that well, I didn't do that enough, or maybe I did that too much, but whatever it may be, it is our own judgment that holds us to account. Sometimes it may be the judgment of our families, but it is not the judgment of God. That is a fear that we can put wholly aside, and I think that is valuable. And that's probably why humanists look death more straightforwardly. We know it is the end of life. My chemistry master at school said there was only one scientific law to which there were no known exceptions. And that law was, thou shalt die. It's just that people get embarrassed about it. But actually, it's inevitable, and it is not something I welcome, but it is not something that I believe I can run away from.
Do you think there's scope for the finality of death actually to be something quite positive in humanism?
You know, actually, I don't. I would quite like to live forever. I really want to know what will happen in 100 years' time. I would love that. I would like to know what will happen to my grandson and any other grandchildren. That would be really good. It's not going to happen. And actually, we all kind of know it's not going to happen, but some of us kid ourselves. So, no, I don't think it's positive, except insofar as facing the truth always has a value. Because denying the truth leads us into all kinds of follies and errors, and therefore we must always say, where is the balance of evidence? What is it? And actually, if you don't face the threat of a vengeful God, then all there is to be feared is the things that happen prior to death, the experiences of the end of life, which can be difficult, there is no question. But those things are common whether you are a Christian or a Muslim or a humanist.
I like the idea you mentioned of what we have to be afraid of is not necessarily God but ourselves and our own judgment. And I suppose, say, a psychologist of religion might want to say something like, actually, what we think is God is our internalised selves judging us.
It seems to me that the people who believe most firmly in religion haven't formed the views themselves. They have adopted views from holy texts, from preachers, increasingly from the internet. And these are simply views they've adopted wholesale, not views they've thought through for themselves. That seems to me to be unhealthy. Picking up again something you said at the beginning, we don't believe in taking things on authority. We don't believe in saying, well, it's in the holy book, and therefore it must be true. All books are written by men, whether they are the Bible or the Quran or the final guru of the Sikhs, and therefore they can be set in a historical context and they can be judged.
Coming back to that critical approach, one of the problems I might have with that is even somebody who's a self-professed humanist who follows a scientific method, tries to avoid bias, aims for objectivity, all those scientific and humanistic ideals, ultimately we can't interrogate everything. Even if we go and read a university research study, we didn't carry out the study, we didn't carry out the experiments. To some extent, everything in life largely relies on hearsay, and if we were to interrogate everything, it's not perhaps the most practical approach.
It's quite impractical. And therefore, as a substitute for doing it ourselves, we look to other people, friends perhaps. On appropriate matters, we may look to see what the scientific evidence is. And there are ways of judging the evidence which don't require you to be an expert. Take an example. Suppose the issue of climate change is raised. Now, you don't have to be a climate scientist, so I don't say, let me study the models, let me look at the programming. I say, who has evaluated the models? Do the people who have evaluated the models look to me like people who are well qualified to be able to do this? Is there a consensus amongst scientific societies about this? And so in practice, I look for a balance of, not of authority, but of judgment. And if you do that in particular, you find that 97% of scientists with the ability to understand the work believe that climate change is real and is caused by human activity, and 3% hold some different view. So it seems to be pretty safe to say, well, actually, the majority is right. Now, I leave open the possibility that they may be wrong. And where the consensus is weaker, then you may have to follow some judgment.
Returning back to this question of hope and healing, what can humanism offer a sick person?
The obvious things are the power of science and medicine and of all the activities that now go round those in a hospital, the radiology, the physiotherapy, all of that, I take, is given. People need more than that. They need a decent place to live. It needs to be comfortable, it needs to be warm, and people also need a social situation. They need friends and relatives to talk to. Humanists as such can bring just our human selves by listening, by taking them seriously. We know that the mind has a power over the body in some circumstances. We know the placebo effect. We know hypnotism. As you mentioned, Derren Brown uses this principle a lot. If we can encourage people to feel better about their situations, then I think that can only help the process of healing with a greater cheerfulness. And feeling cheerful is itself a value. I think humanists can do a range of things like that.
So what do humanists think is the point of life? Do they think it has any meaning? What is the meaning, if it has any?
Well, this is an odd question. Let me give the philosophical answer and then a more practical one. Philosophical answer is that meaning is a term you can attach to a statue, to a text. You can ask what a text means, but you can't ask what a pig means. Pigs don't mean anything, they just are. Well, the same is true for human life. Human life doesn't mean anything, it is. It is a thing that you experience, not an intellectual activity. But actually, many people do feel their life needs to have a meaning, as I would say, a purpose. Do you think you can make a contribution to society by talking to others and looking after them?
So the final question I wanted to ask you was that some of our listeners may be interested in finding out more about how they can get involved in humanist activities and meet other humanists. Can you tell us a little bit about your organisation, the North London Humanists, and what they do?
OK, well, the North London Humanist group is quite a small group. It meets in Enfield on a monthly basis. We have social meetings, we have discussion meetings. We have a presence on the internet, so you can just look us up, North London Humanist Group. We'll be very happy to see you. Whatever your views on the existence of God, we are a non-discriminatory organisation. If you're not in North London, then you might want to look at other humanist groups, and the best place to start that would be to contact the British Humanist Association, also via the web, and they will help you to find a humanist group in your area.
Brilliant. Thank you so much for joining us today, David, and for helping us to understand how humanists approach healing here on The Remedy. Before I let you go, I do just have one more final question. As we know, lots of religions draw on the power of music and worship to heal their followers. As a humanist, what song do you find speaks for your beliefs and could offer comfort for other humanists?
I think the obvious choice, and the one I'll make, is Imagine by John Lennon.
And the world will live as one.
Radio Brockley, the UK's official #1 hospital radio station.
For the next segment of The Remedy, I'm going to explore the Hindu approach to healing, which should serve as a useful point of comparison with the worldviews we have already explored. The notion of karma takes centre stage in all Hindu traditions and is particularly relevant when it comes to understanding suffering. The law of karma simply states that what goes around comes around. In other words, any suffering we endure, either mental or physical, is the consequence of suffering we have imposed on others previously, either in a current or a past lifetime. This does not necessarily mean that suffering is a punishment. Instead, it is a natural consequence of the moral laws of the universe regulating our behaviour. The prime importance of karma in this tradition requires that Hindus take a holistic approach to health and well-being. In the Ayurvedic tradition in particular, mind and body are one, and so there is no such thing as an exclusively physical or mental illness. Physical pain may be the result of our poor personal conduct, for instance, and so can also be remedied through changes to our behaviour. Practicing yoga, which literally means to yoke together, allows Hindus to focus on connecting the mind with the body. This will allow them to work on balancing their physical, spiritual and mental karma, and also has a number of health benefits. For instance, it can reduce blood pressure and relieve stress. Making sense of the law of karma is also supposed to be therapeutic in itself. Hinduism promotes coping with suffering by accepting it as fair and just. This means understanding that it is not random and not unfair. According to karma, it is exactly the correct situation for the individual to be in based on their previous actions. In alleviating our suffering, Hinduism also wants us to understand that whilst the body may be in pain, the self or the soul is not affected. In the Bhagavad Gita, which is a very famous and important Hindu text, Arjuna explains that the soul is rather different to the body. He says, "Weapons do not cut it, fire does not burn it, waters do not wet it, and wind does not weather it." Therefore, if the self is something beyond physical, then all of our physical pain is actually just a temporary state, and one that does not affect our inner self or our soul. This in itself is intended to offer some consolation for those that are suffering. Hinduism also promotes a philosophy of detachment. Being attached to anything is understood as a stumbling block to achieving liberation from the cycle of birth and rebirth, which is called samsara. Only by recognising that the self can be detached from this physical world of suffering can the self escape it. This means that if we are able to stay neutral and detached and calm in the face of pain and not desperately strive for pain relief, then we can ultimately be liberated from all forms of suffering. I'm joined today by Matthew Martin, a doctoral student at the University of Oxford. Matthew is researching Hinduism in Nepal and Kerala in South India, and he has a keen interest in Eastern ideas about mind and body. Matthew, thank you so much for joining us today.
Oh, thank you for inviting me, Naomi.
So the Hindu tradition suggests we try to detach ourselves from the pain we are experiencing in order to relieve it. Trying to ignore pain seems to me to be quite unhelpful, unnatural, and also unrealistic. How would Hindus respond to that criticism?
Well, I think for the majority of Hindu practitioners, pain and awareness of pain is vital in order to recognise symptoms of ill health and that you actually have an underlying medical problem. So if ignoring pain was a viewpoint adopted by all followers of Hindu tradition, then I don't think there'd be as many healing traditions and healers dotted across India and Nepal. For example, in Ayurveda, which you just mentioned, it's an ancient Indian system of medicine, 2,500 years old. And their ideas of the body is that it's split into three parts called doshas or dutas. They're like tissue systems. And if there's a certain imbalance in these tissues, then this can cause pain and ultimately disease. So I think you have to have an awareness of pain before you have a diagnosis and the need to go to an Ayurvedic practitioner. But I think some Ayurvedic doctors actually suggest that pain can occur in perfectly good health and that sometimes a preoccupation with pain is a psychological problem and that this can divert patients to use antibiotics or drugs without really needing to. So they focus more on self-healing. I think the only instance of people actually rejecting the body and pain entirely is rather idealistic. And this is usually reserved for Hindu holy men and women called renouncers. And they attempt to completely reject the body and the cycle of rebirth, which you just discussed, called samsara, in order to achieve a higher form of spiritual liberation, like a higher goal. So I think for the most part, I think ignoring pain altogether isn't necessarily advised in Hindu tradition, and it's really reserved for certain religious experts who are trying to go beyond the body and gain the spiritual goal.
That's really interesting, Matt. So does that mean that the average kind of Hindu who's not kind of focusing their whole life on trying to reach enlightenment and becoming a holy man or holy woman aren't so, you know, they aren't advised to detach from the pain? Or if they are advised to detach from it, how do they do that? What is the method that would be suggested for them to not kind of be so attached to the body and physical pain?
Well, I think it's mostly religious observance, puja, meditation, and also different forms of breathing exercises. And very much healing is holistic in South Asia. So there's many different forms, and you don't really need to stick to one particular tradition or idea. So, yes.
And does that mean that the average person who's not kind of committed their life to becoming a holy man is also not trying to reach enlightenment? Or is that kind of a side goal?
Usually, I think it's a side goal. I think you need to, in order to fully reject the body, you need to follow a strict path of renunciation through this detaching from the body. And I think for a majority of Hindu practitioners, this isn't possible. So I think they do try to alleviate pain, and they are somewhat attached to the body.
Great. So one of the ways that you've suggested, in addition to meditation, is also yoga, which is obviously really important in Hinduism.
Yes.
And this could be a way that suffering could stop, and also practicing yoga could also actually change our kind of behaviour more generally. Again, in principle, that seems great. It seems really helpful. But if somebody is already quite sick, they're physically incapacitated, they're lying in a bed or something, they might not be in a position to kind of do yoga and engage in these quite physically demanding activities. So what else could they do then?
Well, I think there's many different methods that you could use in order to do this. And I think if you can't do physical yoga, then you can adopt a form of breathing yoga called pranayama, which is controlled breathing that calms certain mental states. And then this also calms the body as well. So there's many different ways you can do this. And also music actually is used. So, playing sacred music, chanting sacred music is very much prevalent in many temples in Nepal and India. And it's believed that the vibrations affect and calm muscular tension. And also music is used in public rituals, and it's believed to actually rid the area, the social region, of disease or any social disputes as well. So music has this capacity to really to calm and also to heal. More generally.
That's really interesting. So that means that even if you are kind of lying in bed, you can actually still do all these kind of different things to help better your situation.
Yes.
Great. So one of the themes we've kind of been exploring is how different religious traditions respond to scientific advancements in medicines. Could an approach which recommends that we try to kind of transcend some of that physical pain lead some Hindus to reject the use of medicine, and Western medicine in particular? I mean, how do Hindus feel about medicine generally?
Well, I think in both places where I've been doing research, in India and also the southern state of Kerala in India, Western medicine is actually considered the most popular, the most effective, and has a lot of prestige. But it's also interesting that in Kerala, if you're training to be a doctor, for example, all of the doctors, they have a foundational training in general medicine. And then from there, they can branch off into different traditions. For example, they could branch off into Ayurveda, Western medicine, or homeopathy. So it's interesting how ancient medical systems like Ayurveda have been brought into the institution of medicine, and they practice on the same level. And it's not uncommon for patients who experience certain chronic conditions that aren't easily cured. They visit multiple healers. So, for example, they'd go to the Western, the Ayurvedic, and the kind of local religious healer. So it's very plural, the way it works. And also in Nepal, in Kathmandu, where I was staying, some people believe that the problems in their bodies are related to stress, and that if they visit a certain healer called a Bidya, this person has specific religious power, that if they go with their particular physical problem and the healer would brush that area and then it would be cured, because they believe that the area is being attacked by external evil forces called doite. So I think systems of medicine in Hindu South Asia are very plural. But I think in India and in Nepal, Western medicine or evidence-based medicine is considered the most effective and the one you'd go to first.
Right, so that's interesting. So it's quite an inclusive approach,
Yes.
open to taking on board lots of different types,
Yes.
and doesn't really necessarily try to kind of exclude any in particular.
Yeah.
Yeah. So overall, if you kind of had to summarise then, what would you say Hinduism can offer people who are suffering and need healing?
Well, I think it's many different avenues like we discussed. You can go to a Western and Ayurvedic and also local ritual healers. And they're concerned not with the pain within individuals, but social healing and family healing, like Reverend Jody, who discussed earlier about Jesus and the healing that happens in the social form. And these are called rituals of affliction, where an oracle who embodies a particular god called Bhairav is a very powerful masculine god. And this oracle then mediates a particular family dispute or a social problem. And then in so doing, this kind of cures the individual who has the problem. So essentially this works as a kind of religious therapy as such, like we previously discussed.
Yeah, that is very interesting to think about those kind of similarities between Christianity and Hinduism, which developed at such different parts of the world, but also put so much emphasis on kind of social healing in order to kind of achieve individual healing.
Yeah, yes.
Thank you. Thank you, Matt, for joining us today.
It's a pleasure, thank you.
So thank you to all of our guests and listeners joining us here today on The Remedy. We are very fortunate to be in a world today where we do have access to healthcare, and there is no doubt that we should harness what is available to us. Our achievements in the medical sciences have been a product of our ingenuity and also our hard work as a species. They should not be taken for granted. But looking towards a spiritual tradition for that little bit extra is something that many of us still do, always have done, and always will do. When it comes to healing, medicine and religion are simply not mutually exclusive. Ultimately, those who are sick should be free to seek strength wherever they find it, be it ancient philosophies or new scientific insights on their road to recovery. Matt, I'd just like to end by asking you, what song would you suggest from a Hindu tradition that you might recommend for healing?
This is one I heard quite frequently when I was walking around in Kathmandu, and it's called the Gayatri Mantra. It's a very old mantra from the Vedas, very, very ancient text, and it's excellent, so yes.
Thank you very much. I'm Naomi Richman, and this is The Remedy. Thank you for listening.